Well, welcome. We're here today at Borders with Rhoda Janzen, the author and poet. And we're here today to talk about your new book, Mennonite in a Little Black Dress, which is out in paperback today. So congratulations on your memoir.
Thank you.
Now, this has gotten a lot of critical acclaim as well as popular acclaim. So lots of big names like Elizabeth Gilbert, who's a big fan of the book. How has that positive feedback been for you?
Well, it's been, of course, delightful to appeal to several different kinds of audiences, but it's also stretched me in ways. I was imagining the book to be a kind of popular memoir. I wasn't imagining it to be a serious memoir. Mm-hmm. And to know that it has appealed to those kinds of critics has really been challenging and stretching for me.
Now, you're a poet by trade.
Right.
What inspired you to write a memoir?
Nothing. I didn't want to write a memoir. I wasn't planning on writing a memoir. But I was in a weird personal circumstance and I had nothing else to do. So I went for it. I took a risk.
The words just flowed and...
Yeah, they did. Actually, I wouldn't have done it had I not received some encouragement from a writer girlfriend. And I was at home visiting my parents in a fully grown-up way when I was 43 with nothing else to do and my life in shambles. And so I was writing her funny emails about how weird it is to move back in with your folks when you're in your 40s. And she started saving the emails and saying, more of those. And then she started saying, why don't you begin to string those together in a narrative form? And so finally I did.
Well, you bring up that if this was a really rough patch in your life, really
Mm-hmm.
everything that could have gone wrong
Mm-hmm.
had gone wrong.
Right.
And when a lot of people write memoirs about that sort of circumstance, you know, there are a lot of tears and there's a lot of angst, but yours is filled with humor. So why did you approach it from a humorous perspective?
I think that humor is often the byproduct of gratitude. And so I wasn't setting out to be funny, but I was setting out not to be bitter. And the opposite of that is to try to cultivate gratitude. And so there I was in my community of origin, much more conservative community than the one I chose for myself as an adult. And so really the way to negotiate that for me was to say things like, wow, I'm so happy and grateful I made it here. I'm happy and grateful that these are my folks. I'm happy and grateful that this is my quirky history. And as I began rehearsing those kind of patterns of gratitude, the humor just flowed out.
Well, the way that you write about your mother in this book, she's obviously just hilarious. She's quite the pistol. Do you think that you got your humor from her, or is that just something inherent in the upbringing that you had?
I think both from my father and my mother. They both have a lively, fabulous sense of humor, as do all my siblings. And my parents always encouraged us as we were growing up, not to take ourselves too seriously. And I think that's one of the ways I was able to sort of distance myself from some of the trauma and the tragedy of those couple of years and loosen up a little with the humor.
Is that something that you find when you're giving friends or your students advice when they're going through a rough patch? Do you ask them to look on the humorous side?
That's a good question. In terms of their own personal work, I'm pretty careful because I want to send students who are struggling to student services where people are qualified to help them. But in their actual creative work, if they're writing poetry or memoir, then absolutely it's one of the first things I do. Show them that sometimes the serious content is best framed with levity and humor.
So what did you find to be the most different between writing poetry and writing a memoir?
That's a good question too. Really the ease. Poetry is something I've been training for most of my adult life. I mean, I went to school with it. I studied with these great poetry masters of the 20th century. And so to sit down and write poetry was a kind of exercise in intellect as well as creative letting go. But here, it wasn't an exercise in intellection in any way. I sat down and I said, you know what, I'm just going to write the story about my homecoming and what it's like to have been raised Mennonite. And it was free, and it was easy, and it was fast. And another difference is, you know, when you write a poem, typically you spend a couple of hours with a draft, and then you're exhausted and you're done. And this was not that way at all. It was, I ran in the morning my 6 miles. I came straight home to my folks' house. I went out to their gazebo under a slow fan in the heat, and I would suddenly listen, and my mom would say, it's time for dinner. And this was like from, 8 in the morning to dinner. And so it was this kind of really rich, joyful immersion in the writing process that I had never had before.
Do you think that you would have been able to write this book had you not been at your parents? So had you still been at home in that bad space, or do you think being surrounded by them and their love allowed you to?
I think I would have done it. I think it might have been a slightly different book because as it was, one of the pleasures was access to them and to their stories. I'd go in for dinner and they'd be talking about, how my mom, when she was a kid, found a rat in the well at school. And I'm like, wow, fantastic story. That's going into my book, you know, stuff like that.
Well, and you do have some great stories. One of my favorites was the car trip that you took across country, and really the gross out factors that your brothers brought to the car trips.
Supremely gross.
Yeah, those were great. So if you're reading the book, you really have to look at the chapter about the car trip and think about the raisin when you read that. So don't let your, I think, preteen boys read this book, because they'll gross you
They'll get
out in the
ideas.
family car trips. Exactly.